In this video, I'm going to discuss ransomware. This video was brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College. NCyTE Center and this material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation. My name is Philip Kreger. I'm a professor of cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida, and also a co-PI of NCyTE. So the first question is, what is ransomware? So ransomware is malware, which is malicious software that employs encryption to hold a victim's information at ransom. Now, if you're not familiar with the word encryption, I'll be explaining that shortly. So the implanted malware encrypts a user's or an organization's data so that they cannot access files, databases, or applications. A ransom is then demanded by the malign actors to provide access to the company's or user's data. Ransomware is often designed to spread across a network and target database and file servers and can thus quickly paralyze an entire organization. So let's look a little bit more about how ransomware can spread. And later on, I'll give you an actual instance of how that occurred and affected a shipping company. So say that we have an organization with a number of computers and ransomware infects one of those computers. Well, depending upon how the network is set up and the operating system that is used, that single instance of infection can jump from that first infected computer to another, and then another. And theoretically, every computer that's connected to the network, which can essentially paralyze an organization's ability to do business. Now, let's look at the word encryption. Encryption is a process that scrambles data so that it can be read by someone who has the secret key or keys to unscramble it. Now, I want to point out that I've already created a video on encryption, so I would suggest if you want to know more about encryption that you look at that video. So here's an example of readable text. This is called plain text. And so as you can see, we have some numbers and we have some letters, and we can read this. So if we apply an encryption algorithm that is a special kind of math, along with a key that is a secret key, then what we do is we get something that looks like this. And there's no easy way to go from this back to something that's readable without understanding the encryption algorithm that was used, and most importantly, the key that was used in order to scramble that text. So ransomware uses something called asymmetric encryption, which is also explained in more detail in the encryption video. Asymmetric encryption is a type of cryptography that uses a pair of keys to encrypt and to decrypt a file, and those keys are mathematically related. Asymmetric encryption is also called public-private key encryption, and it makes it a little easier to distinguish between the keys when you call it public-private key encryption. This is my public key, as you can see, which just looks like a jumbled data, but this key can be used to either encrypt or decrypt data. And I know that's my public key because it says so right there. Now, public-private key encryption is used by millions or billions of people every day, maybe not in this form, but a different form that is used on the internet and is discussed in the encryption video. But suffice to say, this points out that encryption can be used for good or evil in terms of ransomware. Now, notice this says that this is my public key, and this is a part of public and private key encryption. Well, I can post my public key to a key server so that others can download it and use it to encrypt a file or a message and then send something to me that only I can open with my private key. Let's take a look at what that means. We've got some data, whether it's a file or a message, and I want to encrypt it, and I'm going to use my private key that only I have access to, which then I can use to encrypt that data. And then if somebody wants to decrypt that file, they can go out to one of the key servers and download my public key to decrypt that data. So now the file or message is in its original state. And notice that actually proves, because somebody uses my public key to decrypt a file, the only way that can occur is if my private key was used to encrypt that file, which means that guarantees that this file actually came from me. Now let's look at it on the flip side. So Laura wants to encrypt a file that only I can decrypt. So she downloads my public key from a key server and encrypts the message and then sends it to me. I then use my private key to decrypt that message, which means that only I can decrypt that file or message because it was encrypted with my public key. So what does this have to do with ransomware? Well, malign actors, those hackers we call them, will generate those two keys, then encrypt your data with one of the keys, and then they will attempt to sell you the other key. So it looks something like this. We have our malicious actor who encrypts your data with one of those keys, one of the asymmetric keys that only the actor has access to. Then your files that are sitting on your computer are now encrypted with that asymmetric key. However, you don't have the other asymmetric key. So then in order to decrypt that, the malicious actors will sell you the other asymmetric key so that you can recover your data. Okay, let's get back to ransomware. So what is the ransomware process? So the malign actor infects a company's computer with ransomware. And it's not necessarily just a company, it could be any individual user, but there's more money in companies. The whole idea behind ransomware is it's a business. So the ransomware proceeds to encrypt all of the files using one of the asymmetric keys that is part of the ransomware. After it's infected, the owner of the computer receives something that looks like this. It's a pop-up that says, "Your files have been encrypted." Notice on the left-hand side, payment will be raised on here. So what they're doing is they're trying to force you to quickly pay the ransom by adding some urgency into it. And in fact, in one of the social engineering videos that I created, we discussed why urgency is used in some of the social engineering attacks. Notice below that, it says your files will be lost on this date. Again, there's more of a sense of urgency that's being applied to the user. What's even more interesting is the malicious actors are doing a very good job of explaining not only what happened to your computer, your important files are encrypted. Can I recover my files? Sure, and this is the process you use. And finally, how do I pay? And so down here it lists exactly how to pay with an anonymous currency, in this case Bitcoin, to send $300 worth of Bitcoin to this address right here. And after you do that, you will receive the key and then you can decrypt your files. The process of paying ransom. So the malign actor makes the private key, or that is just the other asymmetric key, available to the victim only after the ransom is paid. But even then, it's been shown recently through ransomware campaigns that have been studied by law enforcement, it's been shown that the malign actors may not provide the key even after the ransom has been paid. So without the private key, that is the other asymmetric key, it's nearly impossible to decrypt the files that are being held for ransom. Later at the end of this video, I'll show you a way to mitigate this issue. So you're probably asking yourself, so what's the big deal about ransomware? How much money are companies losing? According to the FBI's Internet Crime Report, which is a part of the Internet Crime Complaints Center, their 2020 report indicated that they received about 2,500 complaints identified as ransomware with an adjusted loss of over almost $30 million. Now, when you think about the grander scheme of things, how many companies we have in the United States and how much companies are worth, that's not a lot of money. But this is really an underestimate, and even the FBI says it's an underestimate. And the reason is many companies don't want it known that they've been victim to ransomware because it makes them look bad. It makes them look ineffectual. If you think about it, financial institutions or health institutions are not going to want to publicize the fact that they've been hit by ransomware. So other sources have said that cybercrime is much larger than this. If you look on the left there, by 2025, the global cybercrime is estimated to cost about $10.5 trillion. Now, of course, that's a global estimate, but the United States is going to make up a larger part of that. In the middle, you see the global ransomware damage cost predicted to reach $20 billion in 2021, which is this year. However, that's up from only $325 million in 2015. And finally, on the right, you see that every 11 seconds, a ransomware attack on businesses is predicted by this year. So clearly, ransomware is a much larger problem. So from my discussions with cybersecurity experts, I found that some companies will hire incident response companies to handle the ransomware negotiations, because essentially what happens is that some of the ransomware malign actors will ask for, let's say, $50 million or $5 million. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that those companies have to pay that. That can be negotiated down in a lot of cases to something much smaller. Moreover, that there are insurance companies that provide insurance for companies in regards to cyber attacks. Now, if you've seen my maritime cybersecurity videos, you've seen me discuss Maersk, which is one of the largest shipping companies in the world. And in 2017, a single computer on the Maersk network was infected with ransomware. The ransomware spread quickly across Maersk's global IT infrastructure, encrypting hard drives across 170 global offices, forcing recovery efforts to the entire IT infrastructure, including reinstalling software and files on over 4,000 servers, 45,000 PCs, and 2,500 applications over a 10-day period. And the spreading mechanism embedded in the ransomware exploited two vulnerabilities in versions of the Microsoft Windows operating system. So again, a single computer that was infected was able to infect the entire Maersk global IT infrastructure. How are computers infected, or how is ransomware spread? So the number one attack vector, according to the FBI, is through social engineering, commonly email. Now, I've got 3 videos out there that explain all about social engineering, so I would suggest, if you want to know more about that, that you view those videos. So let's look at an example of social engineering. I actually created this video and it was ready to go, and about 5 minutes after this, I received this in my Embry-Riddle email. But notice that it's an email from Microsoft 365 to my Embry-Riddle email regarding a password reset. It says it will expire today, or I can retain my current credentials below. So I could select keep password. I did not click on this because I know it's going to ask me for my current password. I mean, this is a clear indication of social engineering, but let's take this a step further. First of all, I want to point out that this says caution, this email originated outside of Embry-Riddle, which is a good thing. It indicates that this is not coming from an erau.edu domain, but also I hovered my mouse over this keep password, which should go to an Embry-Riddle address, and this is what it says, officeinternalportal.net. So clearly, this is not coming from Embry-Riddle. And finally, if you look up here at the source address, service desk at whatever this is, OKCIDEZ3 at DCRZQ. So this was obvious to me that this was social engineering. Now, as it turns out, our ID department creates these fake social engineering emails to test us as to whether we can determine whether an email is socially engineered or not. But suffice to say, these are the kinds of things that you will see maybe in your corporate email, your company email, or your personal email, with malicious actors trying to gather information from you using social engineering, or asking you to click on a link, or asking you to download and run a file. Now finally, we have to ask ourselves, how can you prevent or mitigate, that is, lessen the effects of ransomware? Well, let's look at some ways. First, since the primary attack vector is through social engineering and emails, you should always be suspicious of links in emails. If you do get an email and it has a link in it, and the email asks you to download something, hover your pointer over that link to determine if the link is a valid and good link. Second, be super suspicious of email attachments. Just because a file has a particular name, for example, free Amazon gift card.exe, doesn't mean that that's what it is. Finally, it's also good to validate the sender's email address. Is the email really coming from yourschool.edu or Amazon.com? And if all that fails, because it often does, is that in an organization, as you see how ransomware spreads, it only takes a single infected computer to potentially cripple the entire IT infrastructure. Therefore, you should always have a backup of your data. So if the worst happens, if you're a victim of ransomware, all your files are encrypted, a backup will allow your IT department to recover and reinstall all critical files. This video has been brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College.